You're listening to Unhooked. Welcome back to the show. My guest today is Kevin Griffin. Kevin is a Buddhist teacher and author known for his innovative work connecting Dharma and recovery, especially through his 2004 book, One Breath at a Time, Buddhism and the 12 Steps. He is a leader of the Mindful Recovery movement and one of the founders of the Buddhist Recovery Network. He has been a Buddhist practitioner for 40 years and a teacher for over 2 decades. His latest book is Buddhism and the 12 Steps, Daily Reflections. You can find out more about Kevin on his website and his YouTube channel, which I will link in the show notes. If you enjoy this episode, please make sure to hit the follow and subscribe buttons to make sure you don't miss any future episodes. And as always, if you feel like leaving a review, it would be much appreciated. So without further ado, please join me in this conversation with Kevin Griffin.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Lipkowitz, and with over 12 years of meditation experience as a mindfulness trainer and coach for high performers, I've become obsessed with helping people break free from compulsive, unhealthy behaviors and addictions and step into a life of true freedom, so that they can finally become their best selves and cultivate deeper and lasting fulfillment. I've created Unhooked, the Breaking Porn Addiction podcast, to give you simple, actionable, step-by-step strategies to master your mind and optimize your life. This is Unhooked. So welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Unhooked. I'm your host, Jeremy Lipkowitz, and I'm excited to be here with Kevin Griffin. Kevin, very excited to have you on the show. I just finished your book, and I'm excited to dive into the world of 12-step recovery and Buddhism. You know, for me, Buddhism was a huge part of my own recovery journey, particularly the insight meditation tradition, Vipassana. And so I'm really curious to know a bit about your own story. And so I'd love to just start with a quote of yours, actually. And this is from the book. And so if you'll just give me a minute to read this quote. In your book, you said, "Many of us imagined sobriety as a bleak, boring place where all the fun was out of life and we would live in eternal purgatory of partylessness. Instead, most of us find an entirely new life, one we couldn't have imagined. Sobriety isn't just a matter of removing drugs and alcohol from our lives. In fact, that's only a small part of it. Sobriety is finding a new way of living that involves engagement where there was withdrawal, generosity where there was self-centeredness, community where there was isolation, joy where there was bitterness, and trust where there was cynicism." And I wonder if you could just talk to me a little bit about that, about, what sobriety and recovery really is to you.
That's great. Thank you, Jeremy. And just to be clear, you're reading from my first book, which is called One Breath at a Time, Buddhism and the 12 Steps. I have 5 others. But usually when people say they read my book, I know which one they're talking about. That one sold a lot more than the others. And I love that quote, actually, not to be too, patting myself on the back, but it does really capture something so vital that is really hard to see from the other side, from before recovery, because our lives are so caught up and really centered around our addictive behavior, whatever it is. And so much of our identity is wrapped up with that as well. So that it's not just, oh, I'm going to, not drink or use anymore, as I said, but it's really discovering another identity, which is really frightening. I mean, in terms of fear and ego-centered fear, loss of identity is right there at the top. I see it in a lot of different ways, and when someone's publicly humiliated, but certainly with addiction, it's like, who am I going to be? So it's a leap of faith in a way, right? And then the 12 steps have a big sort of faith element, turning it over to God and all that kind of language that's not quite, I don't think of it in those theistic terms, but there is this letting go that's demanded, and that's as I say, not just letting go of the addiction, but letting go of identity and trusting that you'll land somewhere, you know, that you won't just sort of float out there as a non-entity.
Yeah, I guess I'm just curious to know, you talk about this other kind of sobriety that we have this image of it being bleak
Mhm.
and, empty, but that it's really this whole other world. And you say that it's a completely new life, one that can't be imagined until you're there. And it's both
Yeah,
appealing and frightening. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about the appealing side of it.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it was a pretty grandiose statement. I'm not sure that that's exactly true for everybody. Certainly has been true for a lot of people I know. It's something about, when you create a vacuum, something comes in, right? And so when that letting go happens around the addictive behavior, something inevitably comes into that. And I mean, here I think I have to draw from Buddhist principles that the foundation of spiritual growth in Buddhist terms is an ethical and wholesome lifestyle and behavior. And so that
Mm,
starts in that external way. And then that also applies to the mind. So there's a lot of letting go that happens, letting go of the addictive behaviors, but letting go of that self-centeredness, as I said, and letting go of what we would say lying, cheating, and stealing, which is part of self-centeredness, right? Just this sort of lack of a sense of responsibility. One thing that comes up is this famous Buddhist alliteration called the bliss of blamelessness. And it suggests, again, that sila, the ethical and moral kind of foundation, actually brings a joy within itself. And as I say, you can't sort of discover it until you step into it. And so
mm,
another way that I think of this is that what I call a return to innocence, that there is
mm,
something about our addiction, which is a kind of corruption and perversity in, that we sort of throw out the rules. And as we become adults, we're now allowed to do adult things, which, are mostly really destructive: smoking, drinking, you know, adult sexual misconduct, and for me, getting sober sort of took me back to a more innocent time, to being a kid, I mean, I'm fortunate that I have a lot of happy memories, and not everybody in recovery has that. I mean, I had my share of trauma, but I still think of my innocence as something joyful. And so there's something
mm.
about letting go of those behaviors that feels childlike and playful and joyful.
Yeah. You mentioned the bliss of blamelessness, and it's one of the things that really resonated with me and resonates with a lot of the people that I work with
Mm,
in the porn addiction space. And just this feeling
yeah,
of being in integrity and the bliss that comes when you're really practicing your sila and living an ethical life. And I'm also kind of reminded of the story of the four heavenly
mhm,
messengers from Buddhism. That the Buddha kind of saw the sick person, the aging person, the dead person, and then saw this monastic walking. And it was this
yeah.
kind of this heavenly messenger, this sign of what a life could be like. And I'm curious for you, was there a moment in your life that had that feeling to it, like a heavenly messenger?
Uh, I feel like there were probably a lot of those in a way. Mostly the fourth messenger, the monk. I mean, I felt drawn to spirituality from an early age. Even as a little boy, I felt a real uh, sort of mystical connection to the Catholic Mass, and I performed it as an altar boy. In my childhood, it was done in Latin, which made it easier to become more mystical because I didn't know what it was about, but it was the atmosphere that created that. So then in my teenage years, certainly music was a spiritual guide for me, and then the spiritual scene that arose in the late '60s, which is when I was a teenager, really drew me. But my problem was that I was an addict, and so there was always this conflict, this inner conflict between what I was drawn to spiritually and what I was drawn to in the material realm. Um, so yeah, for me, the heavenly messengers much more, I think, fell into that kind of positive category, except of course for the heavenly messenger of addiction. When I realized that, or I didn't even realize that addiction was my problem, but when it became evident that the one thing I had not been willing to deal with in all my efforts to solve my life was my drinking and using, that was this huge moment. Of course, I mean, that was really the most transformative moment of my life was waking up on June 7th, 1985 and saying, it's done, it's over. And there was this tremendous feeling of relief. It was very surprising to me because I had certainly never wanted to stop drinking and using. I had always had to manage them, but it seemed like it was necessary to manage them. And it had never occurred to me that there would be a sense of freedom by letting them go. But but the burden of what I had been carrying became really evident when I stopped, and I didn't see it until then, which is weird, but probably not that unusual.
Yeah. I think to me, it seems quite a common thing that we look at almost everything else in our life.
Yeah.
If I just had the right girlfriend, if I just had more money, if I could just figure my career out, then my life would be solved. And we kind of look at everything else except for the addictive behavior, which in your case was maybe
And,
drinking and drugs.
I had also
Um,
done a lot of work on myself. I had done a lot of meditation. I had therapy. Um, it wasn't that I was just trying to solve everything just with externals, although certainly that was a big part of it. But it's quite interesting and really an important part of my story for me, that even though I had been very serious about meditation, that it didn't solve the core issue of addiction, which, I've seen plenty of people take the same route, think that they could take, as they say, a spiritual bypass, that they could sort of solve their emotional problems by meditating them away or chanting them away or, praying them away. And it was only when I got sober, it was only when I stopped drinking and using that um, my meditation practice really took hold and started to influence my life more broadly. And really that, the truth is that I was only working with one area of Buddhism. I was working with the meditative area, skipping over the ethical area, as though that was just a
mhm.
secondary issue. And frankly, at that time, the early '80s, late '70s, in the Buddhist world, there was very little emphasis on sila. there was really this kind of
Mm,
assumption like, oh, well, we're all, you know, we're cool, it's okay to get high now and then, a trip occasionally, but because we're going to get enlightened and then, it won't matter or whatever. I don't know it was just one of those, a
mm,
justification that grew out of the hippie movement, which was, as we know, very influenced and involved in the drug movement. And so my own sort of inner conflict was reflected in that external cultural conflict uh, between a spiritual search and addictive behaviors.
yeah. It's one of the things I find really fascinating about your story is that you, as you say, you really were immersed in meditation and spirituality even before you got into recovery. And you said you have this quote from the book. You said, "Looking back, I see how in meditation it was possible to deceive myself. In silence, in my own mind, what appeared and disappeared was not seen or heard by anyone else. I got no feedback, and besides that, I didn't recognize the nature of my wrongs, the destructive and dysfunctional quality of my thinking, not to mention my behavior. And this is where the 12 steps have something to offer Buddhism." And so for me, I find that really fascinating because my own background is almost entirely in Buddhism, Vipassana, insight meditation, and I was always very allergic to
Mhm.
the 12 steps and to anything that felt kind of religious. And so I'm just curious, for you, what is it that the 12 steps brings to Buddhist practice?
Well, we have to. That requires me to talk about both. But first of all, to directly answer the question, what they bring is what they say in the 12 step literature, rigorous honesty and rigorous honesty about the nature of our addictive behavior. And so um, that, a- and, and I will say the spotlighting of that element of our behavior, not just considering it like, oh, that's a thing, that happens, but really I'm a Buddhist. The Four Noble Truths make it really clear that the problem is clinging. However, most people think of that in less specific terms, and sort of it turns into an abstraction and into kind of like intellectual, like, oh yeah, we need to let go, and without really talking about the first noble truth, the suffering. Like, I mean, it's very really
Mm,
interesting to me, in at least in Western Buddhist communities, I find that there's this real uh, emphasis on positivity. I'm very interested in the
mm,
concept of toxic positivity, and I see a lot of that in spiritual communities. So, if you just talk about the second noble truth without acknowledging the first noble truth, if you just talk about, oh, letting go versus like, what is the suffering? Let me look at that, look at the nature of it. If I'm just saying, oh, I'm clinging to self, I need to let go of self, whatever. It's again, just abstractions that don't really mean much. Nothing happens. You can sit around and meditate and like, oh, everything is empty. And like you can have very deep meditative experiences. And then the bell rings and you go on with your life. And what has really been looked at? So I feel there's a lack sometimes of that kind of uh, willingness to look at ourselves in the challenging way that the 12-step world requires when you have to write a searching and fearless moral inventory. Again, I think there's a tendency in the Buddhist world, like when you go to a Buddhist group, what happens? You walk in to some beautiful like space and maybe you say hello to somebody, but very often it's just silent and you meditate. And then some figure up on a stage gives this inspiring talk, and you're like, oh, that's so beautiful. Like, oh, that's really great. I'm really, and then you leave And so what did we miss? Well, first of all, we missed community, right? So obviously that's
Mhm.
one of the three jewels in Buddhism, but in Western Buddhism, again, it's been way underemphasized. The recovery world, the 12-step world, the foundation is community. It's not the 12 steps. It's meetings and community and the support
Mm.
community that allows you to be honest and helps you. And yeah, I'll say that allows you to be honest and encourages you to be honest is really the most transformative aspect of the 12 steps, not step one, step two, step three. Yeah, that's a useful model for this work, but I don't think it's what
Mm.
the 12-step world is built on, even though that's what I write all my books about, because it's hard to write books about, going to a meeting. Yeah.
Right, right. But it's almost like the secret sauce of the 12 step is that encouragement to be vulnerable and to be human and to talk about the
Absolutely.
messiness of
And one
what's
of the
going on
things
in
to
your life.
notice about the 12 steps is that they say, we admitted we were powerless. And then that we carries over to every step. We turned our lives over.
Mm.
We made a searching and fearless moment. So we understand that we're not doing this, alone, that we're doing it with others, and that indeed our behavior is not unique, that there
Mm.
is, it's not, there's no shame around it. There's responsibility, but not shame. And, and all of that is very
Mm.
freeing. So you feel yourself going through it with some,
Yeah,
you don't do the steps alone, you know, and they
right.
culminate. The last step says, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to others and to practice these principles in all our affairs. So it's this really expansive idea, which is founded in service and giving it away and in living it in this very fulsome way. And so it
Yeah.
really, uh, it's not really, it's very, I mean, it also really matches up with the idea of letting go of self. Now, in the 12-step world, we talk about self-centeredness more. So it doesn't have that like, oh, the self is empty concept, but that's where it's going. That's where it's pointing. It's easy to get there from that.
Yeah. I find that there are so many parallels, things, and as you write in your book, One Breath at a Time, it's like you take a concept from the 12 steps and say, oh, here's where we see this also in Buddhism, and vice versa. Here's a concept in Buddhism, and here's where we see it in the 12 steps. But I think what's interesting is, even though these concepts and these principles exist in Buddhism, it's what's really emphasized in terms of how people are coming together. It's like the importance of community is talked about. It's one of the three gems in Buddhism. There's the story we all know about how Ananda said, community is half the spiritual life, and
Yeah.
the Buddha said it's all of the spiritual life. But it's really this emphasis on coming together. And I think what's also really interesting, you mentioned, and I've experienced this myself, that part of Buddhism, Vipassana, insight, it's this striving for
Right.
kind of
Right.
saintliness, perfection, this,
Yep.
I want to be a good Buddhist and be virtuous, um and it doesn't necessarily encourage us to really expose our kind of
Right.
the shameful side of things, the dark side. And you have this quote I just want to read. You said, while many people tend to think of spirituality as looking up toward the heights of perfection and saintliness, we must first look down into the darkness of our souls and see and accept our shadow before we attain an honest and authentic spiritual life.
I like the quotes you pulled out. Some of my favorites. Not the, you know, uh, last winter, some of the monks from the Berkeley Buddhist Monastery asked me to meet with them to talk about helping some of their community members who they feel have had problems with addiction. And then further, they asked me to come on an outing. They're working on building a Vihara up in the Santa Cruz Mountains, actually. And it was really interesting. There were a group of lay people and these two monks, and we went and we did some work on the land, and then we had a meal. And after the meal, the monks asked me to speak to the lay people about applying Buddhist principles to a lay life. And essentially, because of what you're talking about, which is that, these lay people, they come around and they put on a good show around the monks, and they make this is largely Asian community. So, that traditional form where they're very generous, they bring food and they're very, bowing to the monks. But it turns out that, outside of that context, there's all this, chaos and disruption in their lives. I don't think just addictive behavior, but that they're not integrating their Buddhist practice into their lives in an authentic way. And it was really shocking to me that these monks would ask me to do that. But because, for me, I always consider monks, okay, well, if I'm around you, you're the teachers, but it was really interesting and very moving that they wanted me to talk about my experience and how I look at my practice as integrated into my life, that my Buddhism is not something that I just take to the monastery. Really, really important. And I will say, too, regarding community, that we have a wonderful monastery in Northern California that's in the Ajahn Chah tradition, the Thai forest tradition, called the Bayagiri. And the former abbot, who's kind of like the emeritus abbot, Ajahn Pasano, is I consider him a friend as well as a teacher. But we've worked together. He's helped me with some of my books. And when I go up to visit, there's not any of this feeling of holiness or sort of, there's formality because there's form, but it doesn't feel stiff or, that there's, we're the monks and you're the lay people. It's like it's very human. And it's, of course there's rituals, but the foundation of it feels very much like we're just here to be a community together, to live together and to support the lay community and to find, freedom to whatever extent we can in this lifetime. And there's just something very touching about that. That's for me more authentic than some of the lay communities that I encounter that feel like they're, what's the term, cosplay? I don't know how to say that word. You know that term? Like, yeah, cosplay.
Cosplay.
Yes.
It's more like a dress up and
they're Buddhist.
kind of
Yes, very performative Buddhism. And I'm being a little extreme about this. I'm kind of, tough on people in this way. It's not like it's that bad, but there's a bit of this out there that I'm very suspicious of, let's say.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like it's coming from particularly, when you're working with people in addictive communities where addiction is really the thing, that this kind of performative aspect, it might work fine for some people who aren't struggling with real addiction. But when it comes to these kind of dark aspects of the soul, it's almost like we really need that radical honesty.
And that's why I
in order
wrote
to
my
heal.
book, One Breath at a Time, wrote that book the way I did with that, the opening of it is pretty intense. It's a description of me getting drunk at a wedding and vomiting and, waking up in my own vomit. And, and that was to let people know, like, okay, I'm one of you. You know, I don't want you to think from the beginning of this that I'm going to come on as some like guru. You know, I've been there because you can't reach an addict from up above, talking down to them. That's why most drug and alcohol counselors are recovering addicts. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the reasons I'm very open with my
Yeah.
own story of porn addiction is to let the people that I'm working with know, hey, I'm not a guru, and I know what it's like to be there, and I think you mentioned this earlier, this feeling that you're not alone being a very healing aspect of the recovery movement. And I'm wondering if you could tell me what is it about that is so
Well,
important?
and I think that's even more important around sexual sex addictions, whatever they are, that historically any kind of addictive behavior was, uh, a source of shame. And we see this, certainly there are cultures, particularly like Asian cultures, that for which that's still the case. Fortunately, in the West, uh, we've lost a significant amount of that. But as long as you feel that your behavior is unique and shameful, you're never going to be able to heal from it. You know, you're because you feel uh, like you deserve to suffer, yeah, because you're bad, right? And you look at the world and you think other people are good and I'm bad, and you carry that around. And what typically happens with that is that those feelings just trigger more addictive behavior. Because one of the main reasons people act out in addictive ways is because they're having feelings that they don't want to feel or that they don't know how to process and how to hold. And so when you add on top of whatever suffering there is, that's sort of the foundational trigger for the addictive behavior, you add on top of that shame, guilt, unique, uh, being uniquely flawed. Well, it's just a toxic combination that just makes it worse and worse. So it's so important. I mean, it's that revelation of walking into a room full of people who you realize these people all did the same shit I did, you know, and they're not judging me. And and they, well, especially in the beginning, it's like, and they seem to be having a good time, you know. They seem to be happy. Like, what is going on? You know. Um, I mean, the other irony too is oh, I don't know if I want to go to a meeting because if I go there, everybody will know that I'm an addict. And it's like, yeah, that's because they're all addicts, so it's okay. So all of that, it completely changes, right, our whole self-image and our perspective on ourselves, which is so, so critical. That again, this ties into Buddhism because Buddhism is telling us not only are you not unique, you know, you're just a conglomeration of, you're not really a solid thing in the first place, but it, really has this sense that um, I don't have to, I'm not really tied to this story. That's just a story. That thing that I think is my identity is a story, and there can be a completely different perspective on it. And so when we see that we're just one of a bunch of people who did similar things, there's a deflation that goes with that, but it's a healthy deflation, right? Because that what they call in AA terminal uniqueness of like I'm just really the worst person in the world. That's inflation. That's ego, right? It's negative ego, but it's ego. And so when you say, "Oh, I'm bad like a whole lot of people are bad," it's deflating. And you can be sort of like, "Oh, well, I guess I'm not so special after all." And then it's like, "Oh yeah, I'm not so special after all." And that's just a really, really important piece. I think without that, any kind of recovery is very difficult because you're going to be in this struggle with this negative self-identity that's just undermining
Hmm.
any kind of you know transformative effect.
Yeah. I'm reminded of the concept of
Right.
mana in Buddhism, or conceit. And I find what's really interesting is they talk about how conceit, normally we think conceit is, oh, I'm better than this person. But in Buddhism, we also talk about how conceit is also,
That's
I'm
right.
worse than this person. Or even what I've heard is even
Mm.
I'm the same as this person is also a form of conceit. And that the only real kind of truth is just I am
Mm.
who I am. This I'm not the same, I'm not worse, I'm not
Well,
better.
conceit, it's an interesting word, right? Because in English, we always we do this so often with Buddhism. It's like, conceit, as you say, is like normally like, oh yeah, I'm the special person. But it's the way I think of that word, it's really about conceiving a self. I conceive that there
Mm.
is a self. So it's really like a belief
Mm.
or a perception, a misperception of self. And and so that's yeah, putting that with so what I think it's about then, and you were pointing to this, is comparing. That's why thinking you're better, worse,
Mhm.
or even the same is just comparing. And that's conceiving, which is
Mm.
creating, which is, we could say, just based in duality. Because anytime there's comparing, it's duality, right?
Mm.
And so, uh, and there's uniqueness. Even if we're similar, or we're saying we're just as we're both good or we're both bad, we're still conceiving these two, and that's what we're really trying
Yeah.
to get out of in Dharma practice is
Yeah.
conceiving.
Yeah. I'm curious to know, so we've talked a little bit about, what the 12 steps has to offer Buddhism. What is it that you think
Uh,
Buddhism has to offer the 12 steps?
oh, I mean, I think, it, yeah, there's at least as much, if not more, going in that direction. Certainly, uh, uh, the first thing that draws people to my work is they get to the 11th step, and the 11th step says we're supposed to meditate. So clearly, Buddhism presents the greatest meditative technologies that have probably ever been created. Um, so yeah, for sure, people get connected with Buddhism through meditation and the potential that leads to of calm and insight. And as you know, like those two terms have very broad meanings, but the calm is something that no matter how long you've been sober, you need ways to deal with stress, and in fact, oftentimes this is what causes relapse, and people can have a lot of time of sobriety or working a program and relapse if they haven't dealt with just that energetic state to be able to modulate our energy, that we can do with meditation, with the concentrative tools. And then the insight, the clarity that comes through as we've been talking about Vipassana, insight meditation, broadens out the spiritual principles of Alcoholics Anonymous or whatever of the 12 steps out into more universal principles. So obviously the three characteristics: everything is impermanent, everything is unsatisfactory, there is no abiding self. Seeing these things and bringing these ideas into our lives, and particularly into the lives of someone in recovery, just gives so much clarity about how we move through the world and how we relate to the world, how we perceive the world. So that's a start. But my second book, which I've just actually re-released this week with a new title, because it never had the right title, but I've changed the title to Buddhism and the 12 Steps, Higher Power, because that's what it's about. That book is about all the ways that we can look at elements of the Dharma as powers. And so it's really trying to help people to work those challenging aspects of the steps that are viewed as theistic and give them another way to view those theistic steps. That the power of mindfulness, the power of loving kindness, the power of wisdom, the power of sila, and all of a sudden turning your will and your life over to these powers can make sense. It makes sense that mindfulness is something that you try to live in alignment with. Loving kindness, that's a power, right? Love is powerful. And if we turn our will and our lives over to the power of love, well, that's a beautiful way to work step 3. So we find that there's a whole bunch of doors that open. And really, I think the 12 steps expand way beyond their original conception when we bring the Dharma into them.
Hmm. Hmm. It's what I've always loved about the Buddha Dharma is like it feels like this kind of beacon of light of these aspirational, before when I was in my addiction, it was all very just, okay, I just want sex and money and fame and validation. And it's just, but then when you open up to these more wholesome qualities of equanimity, like deep equanimity, deep inner peace, loving kindness, compassion, it's this feeling of
Yeah.
like this lightness, almost
Yeah.
like the bliss of blamelessness, like this feeling of inner peace and the lightness of that. And I think, that's one of the things that strikes me is it has this kind of beacon of light quality to
Absolutely.
it.
And the thing is that our instincts, and particularly when we're driven by addictive energies, they lead us in the wrong direction for finding happiness. And of course, this is clearly stated by the Buddha, but we have a misconception of what brings happiness, just as you said. Like, we think that, and society promotes the idea that money, romance, power, possessions, sense pleasures, that this is what will make you happy. And, you know, it's really a problem when you're striving and putting all your energy into doing something that's inevitably going to leave you unsatisfied and you think that's going to bring you happiness. So it's not surprising that people get on this cycle of addiction because they keep thinking, well, I had a moment there when it felt good. I need just to get some more of that. And so I think that when people get their first taste, I know this was true for me, that first taste of really a deep state, I think equanimity is a good way to characterize this, a deep state of peace, of equanimity. You discover, oh, happiness is something different from what I thought it was. And it's that idea that we see in the Dharma that the highest happiness is peace. And that, again, is not what's promoted culturally. and certainly, the capitalist system would have a hard time surviving if everybody adopted that belief. I mean, I think we could figure out a way, but it's clearly capitalism is based on this uh, belief that you can find happiness through the material world. And when you discover that that's not true, that's one of the biggest, most radical shifts that happens in anybody's spiritual growth.
Yeah. I'd love to talk a little bit more about equanimity because for me, I think it was such a turning point kind of insight, that the addictive, um, the nature of addiction is this, the realm of the hungry ghost and this constant hunger, this insatiable leaning forward and wanting this, wanting some form of pleasure. And when you experience equanimity, even just a moment of it, of this kind of sitting, balanced without grasping after something pleasant, without pushing away what's unpleasant, that kind of peace is so liberating. Just the experience of that, because it's such a contrast to the addictive state, the
Right.
state of, I need to have this thing in order to be happy. And one of the quotes, that you wrote in your first book, he said, what causes our suffering isn't a lack of material things or emotional experiences, but rather the craving, the desire itself, the energy that keeps driving us to engage in the chase. And it really is what Buddhism is about, is, that craving is the source of suffering.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about
Yeah.
equanimity.
I think there's two ways that I think it's important to think about it. One is what you're describing, that meditative experience of deep peace and balance, where we feel as if, we can't, nothing can disturb us. It's just a real sense of safety and and um, and faith. There's a faith involved in it that you really trust that you're okay. Where I think it's has a more important role in terms of our maintaining our uh, spiritual balance is in learning to be with the unpleasant, and particularly with the unpleasant, and learning to not learning that it's possible to experience unpleasant feelings, sensations, thoughts, emotions without trying to fix them, and learning to hold them.
Hmm.
And that's really where the possibility of that's what protects us from relapse, and it protects us from suffering, because it's inevitable that we're going to experience the pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral experiences, the Vedana. But it's what we do with those sense impressions that determines our karma. It determines how our lives play out and determines whether we are suffering or not. And so I think an important part of our practice, and we practice this in meditation and then try to carry it into our daily lives, is to sit with the unpleasant, to breathe with that, to allow it, and to watch it fade, so watch its impermanence, and to see uh, how okay it is to feel something unpleasant. Because this is one of my sort of ideas about addiction, or about addicts, that we're not very good at dealing with pain. And I don't know if you can generalize that much about addicts, but well, just put out this idea that perhaps we are, if we can learn to be with pain, and obviously I'm not talking about extreme pain, just discomfort, emotional, physical, mental discomfort. That that can that in and of itself is a really key aspect of recovery. It's to be undisturbed by the pleasant, the unpleasant, or the neutral. Just allowing it to come and go. And that's, it's a key part of our meditation practice, of the insight practice, and it's really a key part of recovery. Because, when we get triggered, you know, off we go. And so if we can learn to just breathe with the triggers, feel the triggers, allow them, hold them in a bigger space to realize, oh, this is unpleasant, but it's not going to last forever. It's not killing me. And I can take steps to change it in wholesome ways, right? And of course, that's a lot of what we do in recovery, is finding skillful and wholesome ways to respond to our experiences in life. That we don't go for a drink, that we call a friend, that we don't, uh, go on the internet to search for some good porn. We, take a walk. We, call a friend. Definitely a lot of calling friends, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, in 12 steps, it definitely seems that that's
Well,
one
I
of the
don't know
main
if like
strategies.
meditating is always the best idea when we're feeling triggered either, because unless you have a very strong
Yeah.
meditation practice, sitting down and doing nothing can just like allow the mind to sort of become more susceptible.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's where it's beautiful to be honest about the shortcomings of Buddhist practice when it comes to recovery. That, you know, sitting and meditating isn't always the best option, even though kind of in the Buddhist world we like to say,
Yeah,
oh, okay, like sit with it, you know, and like be with your discomfort. But sometimes you
yeah,
need to go take a cold shower
yeah,
or call a friend
yep,
or do
yep,
some
exactly.
push-ups.
Get some
Yeah.
exercise, absolutely. The idea that there's one solution is always to me, a setup. You know, it's like, oh well, if that doesn't
Mm.
work, then you're just not doing it right. It's like, I don't know. Uh,
Yeah. It's a
yeah, and
little
I mean,
simplistic
if you're like maybe a
sometimes.
highly evolved meditator, who can sit down and just go into samadhi right away, great. I mean, like the Buddha said when he was dying at the last, probably months of his life, he said the only time he could be free from pain was if he, went into a meditative absorption. But, he presumably could just sit down and go into a meditative absorption. Most of us need about 2 weeks of silent practice before we get anywhere close to that. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious, is there anything that you wish you knew at the start
Mm,
of your recovery
wow.
journey?
That's a terrible question. I don't mean that it's a very good question. It's a challenging question. Hmm. I, I guess I was a little slow to really jump in. So I guess I wish I had known uh, that it was worth just jumping in. Now, I literally stood in the back of meetings for the first year. I did not raise my hand, take people's phone numbers. Uh, I didn't share. I just watched. And that was very risky. And it didn't, I mean, again, everything uh, can be a learning experience. And that was a learning experience that I feel is valuable now, but definitely it was not helping me then. It was not something that I would have rather, been more involved right away, not held back.
Hmm. Hmm. I wonder if it was almost a necessary way for you to get in the kind of the safety of not needing to dive right in, but kind of it was a
For
safe
sure,
place to
and
go.
even your question, it's kind of like, no, I think everything had to happen. I mean, I'm not like a fatalist, but everything that happened has had a benefit and has been part of a process. And we can't skip ahead in a process, right? Obviously we all wish we could, um, skip over the hard parts or, but it just life doesn't seem to work that way. Uh, uh,
Hmm. Yeah. What do you think most people get wrong about 12-step recovery?
that it's religious. I don't think it's religious. I mean, I heard you use that term and I don't, and, and so, yeah, I mean, that's the first thing. And that it's cult-like because everybody says, "Hi, my name's Kevin and I'm an alcoholic." They make you say that. I think people look at the surface elements of it without understanding, the deeper power of it. And the last thing, the other thing, and this particularly for people who aren't even, addicts, people don't realize that 12-step recovery and any recovery is much more than stopping a certain behavior. People very much identify, you know, the 12 steps as, oh, then you'll stop drinking, then you'll stop taking drugs, then you'll stop using porn. And like that was the end of the process. That is the beginning of the process. There's a lot more to the process. There's one step about stopping. The rest of it's the other 11, which is about living as a person in recovery and evolving as a person in recovery. So those are a few things people get wrong.
Yeah, it's beautiful that a lot of people think of recovery as kind of stopping some behavior,
Yeah,
but really it's about
absolutely.
evolving and growing.
Yeah, and I will say, going back, I think there's definitely an idea that, and I understand this. I mean, I've debated this with people, but that the God of the 12 steps is the God of basically fundamentalist Christianity or evangelical Christianity. That's one of the things people get wrong. The word
Mm,
God, I think, has gotten a bad name. It's gotten a bad rap.
yeah. And I imagine in the latest book, the Buddhism and the 12 Steps, a higher power, you kind of go through
Absolutely.
some of that.
I mean, I don't believe in
Yeah.
a God like, the God that I believed in when I was, 6 years old. I mean, that's a childish idea, and people grow up and keep that idea. I talk about this in that book. Buddhadasa Bhikkhu, who you may have, be familiar with, great Thai forest master. He did quite a little bit of work with uh, Christianity and Buddhism and interfaith work. And he talked about how people learn when you're a child, you're taught like God is this man up in the sky in the clouds with a white beard, and that's just something you tell children. But then people never evolve beyond
Mm,
that, and so they completely miss uh, what the meaning of God or what the potential meanings of God are that are of value, and how we can have a
yeah.
relationship to the world as this as including and involving powers that we have to deal with. We have to deal in Buddhism. It's the power of karma, and that's essentially the higher power of Buddhism. Like you can't cheat karma.
Yeah.
You can't get around it. It's more powerful than you. You can either get, harmonize with it or you're going to get slapped down. It just doesn't, there's just no choice in it. And that's a lot like Jehovah. It's just like it's just not a guy. It's not like a being. And it's not personal.
Right.
There's nothing personal about it. It's not about you, or you can say some words. Oh God, please be nice to me. Like karma doesn't care what words you say. Yeah.
It's just the way the
I mean,
world
and you're
works.
creating
It's
karma.
the
When you say a
Yeah.
prayer, you're creating karma. And that can be uplifting and positive karma because you're planting positive thoughts in your mind, but you're not talking to some force out there that's going to say, oh, that person down there, Jeremy, he deserves an extra bonus because he said nice words to me. I mean, it's so stupid. Sorry.
Yeah. No, this is one of the things I really appreciate about for me, it feels like the Western Vipassana tradition, the Western Theravada tradition
Yeah.
is very real.
Yeah.
You know, it's very honest. It's down to earth. It's grounded. It's not a lot of gurus that you have to bow down to. It's people who are saying, listen, this sounds like a load of bullshit. I'm human. I, yell at airport
Right.
security guards sometimes too, and my
Hmm.
emotions get the better of me. And I find that very comforting to have
Yeah.
that kind of approach.
Well, I know. If you're not real, what are you? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting in in the book, your first book, you have the story of, is it Ananda that
Yeah.
the kind of the
That's
spiritual guru that you
that's how I
followed?
knew him.
And yeah, it was quite cringeworthy to read that. And, it felt like watching, one of these Netflix documentaries
Oh,
on how to be a cult
I
leader
know.
kind of thing.
Yeah. Low rent cult, as I like to call it, following a homeless guru.
Yeah.
I mean, the Buddha was a homeless guru, but, I don't think Ananda was the Buddha. Afraid
Yeah.
not.
Yeah. Yeah. What would you, if someone's listening to this and let's say they're
Yeah.
dealing with porn addiction and they're on the beginning of, having these moments of clarity of waking up to the fact that it's not healthy for them and not improving their life. Is there any advice that you would have for someone like that listening?
Mhm. Advice. Would anybody listen to
Words
advice?
of
No,
wisdom or
I mean,
advice?
I think
Yeah.
the most important thing is to recognize really clearly your own suffering. You know, w- it's like, because not recognizing that is being in denial. And that's what allows you to continue any kind of self-destructive behavior, any kind of behavior that's harming you and others. You have to hold it away from you. You can't fully face it. So fully looking at the feelings that come over you, and that whole process of the grasping, the feeling of need, that then, the acting it out, and then the experience afterward, and to see, wow, is this necessary? Like, these are choices, and to see. So to me, so that's number one, is to really see the suffering, because you have to be motivated to give up an addiction. It's hard. And the motivation is to honestly see the suffering. And then the other thing to me is to really be clear about what are the triggers, and avoid those triggers, and work really hard to avoid those triggers, and to replace them, and find alternative choices to make, behaviors, things to do that support you moving in a different direction. But you have to, once we get triggered into any kind of craving, there's a line you cross in which there's no going back. You're going to act it out. You're going to drink. You're going to go and, you know, uh, act out on the porn, whatever the addiction is. So, the key thing in terms of actually not doing it is to not letting that craving arise. Um, and so both of those things really involve mindfulness. To be mindful of the pain is to get that motivation, and then to be mindful of the triggers and those moments when, oh, I really need to make another choice right now, or I'm going down that old pathway. So that's, for what it's worth, that's my advice.
Yeah. I guess what I'm hearing from you is to really, as you say, to
Yeah.
be aware of the suffering, to be aware of the ways that the craving, the longing,
Yeah.
it's insatiable. Like it doesn't truly
Yeah.
satisfy.
It absolutely doesn't, right? As you know, as we both know, like, and we fool ourselves into thinking that it's worth it in some way. But if we see how much suffering there is involved in it, that undermines that belief that it's worth it. But it's also really important to just be able to, like, I've worked at times with making vows, like that I identified triggers and making vows to avoid them, like so that I would be very clear. I think it's really important to be very specific about the things that set you off, uh, rather than just like, oh, I'm just going to stop. Oh, I really need to not do that anymore. It's like, yeah, okay, but watch the process. Catch that when it's like you're really tired or you got really angry, you're lonely, you know, um, you've been exposed to some, you know, you see someone or, or you're watching a movie with somebody and something comes on that sets you off. Like really be aware, that's triggering. Okay, I really need to like turn away. Yeah.
Mm. Mm. Are you familiar with the book
Yeah,
The Little Prince? Do you remember the story of the baobab tree?
vaguely. Remind me.
It's this one of these little vignettes where, the prince lands on this planet and he has to uproot these little baobab seedlings, these little plants, because if he doesn't uproot them when they're small, over time they grow to these massive trees that end up
Oh,
destroying the planet, and they become too deeply rooted to actually pull out once they're big. And so it's this beautiful lesson on really being diligent on uprooting these things in the beginning, like nipping them in the butt, and just really being diligent of doing that work while they're still small. Because if you procrastinate, if you say it's not a big deal and you let them grow,
mm,
they get out of control. And for me, it's a beautiful kind of reminder to do the work while you still have the power, while you still have the
that's
resources.
yeah, perfect correlation for what I'm talking about. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Kevin, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I'm very grateful for you for coming on the podcast and spending some time here. Um, I'm wondering, where can people find out? You said you are re-releasing your book.
I mean, just
Where
my
would you want to send
website,
people?
kevingriffin.net. That's pretty much got everything on there. I do Zoom classes uh, every week, although I'm going on a retreat starting next week for 6 weeks, but I'll be back on Zoom in December, and then I do classes and retreats. The next year I'm teaching. I've got 5 retreats scheduled, so they're everything, and that all of those things are on my website. I also have like a YouTube channel that you can get through there. And yeah, books, and, there's lots of me out there. Yeah, really
All the good stuff. Yeah. Well, we'll link all the
great.
links in the show notes below. Um, so, Kevin, it's been wonderful,
Thank
and
you.
appreciate
Thanks
you
very much,
coming on.
Jeremy. Great to talk with you.
All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Unhooked. We'll catch you on the next episode.